The bathroom mirror showed Stephen's reflection standing 3 feet to the left while he brushed his teeth at the sink. His image grinned with yellow teeth and wild eyes, raising a straight razor to its throat, while Stephen held only a toothbrush. The reflection dragged the blade across its neck, black blood streaming down the glass as Stephen stumbled backward, toothpaste foam dripping from his real mouth. "Hello, Stephen," came a child's voice from the Amazon Echo on his nightstand, crackling through the speaker with gleeful malice. "Wanna play?" The device hadn't been activated, its blue ring dark and lifeless, yet Chucky's unmistakable giggle echoed through the bedroom. Stephen's spine went rigid as the voice continued, "I know what you did to little Timmy." The mirror cracked down the center with a sound like breaking bones, and Stephen's twisted reflection stepped through the fractured glass, emerging into the bathroom with the razor still dripping. It moved independently now, stalking toward him while the real Stephen pressed against the wall, watching his own face contort with homicidal glee. Behind him, the echo's volume increased, Chucky's laughter growing louder and more unhinged. Stephen had been spiraling since the accident 6 months ago, his nephew Timmy's drowning at the family lake house while Stephen was supposed to be watching. The guilt had eaten through his savings on therapy and sleeping pills, forcing him to move into this cramped apartment when he couldn't make rent on his old place. But nothing had prepared him for this supernatural assault on his crumbling sanity. The reflected Stephen lunged with the razor, and the real Stephen dove sideways, crashing into the hallway as the bathroom lights flickered and died. Chucky's voice followed him, now emanating from every electronic device in the apartment. "You let him drown, didn't you? Watched those little bubbles and did nothing." The microwave beeped out Morse code spelling TIMMY while the television turned on by itself, showing grainy footage of the lake house dock. Stephen ran to his laptop, desperate to find answers, but the screen displayed only a single line of text appearing letter by letter. "Good guys don't let children die." The keyboard keys began pressing themselves, typing out details of Timmy's final moments that only Stephen could have known. His heart rate spiked as he realized the entity knew everything. How he'd been drinking, how he'd dozed off in the chair, how he'd woken to find his 8-year-old nephew floating face down in the water. The apartment grew colder, frost forming on the windows despite the summer heat outside. Stephen's breath came in visible puffs as every clock in the place began chiming different hours, creating a cacophony of mechanical sounds. The refrigerator hummed a children's lullaby while ice cubes clinked against the door in rhythmic patterns. Something was orchestrating these manifestations, using his guilt as a conduit. "Time to play hide and seek," Chucky's voice whispered from the smoke detector above. "But this time, you're it." The lights cut out completely, plunging Stephen into darkness. He fumbled for his phone's flashlight, but the device was dead, its battery somehow drained. Emergency lighting kicked in from the hallway, casting everything in an eerie red glow that made shadows dance like living things. The air smelled of pond water and decomposing leaves. Stephen stumbled toward the front door, but the deadbolt wouldn't turn. The key snapped off in his hand, leaving him trapped. Behind him, footsteps echoed through the apartment, small, childlike steps that squelched with each impact, as if walking through mud. The sound of dripping water grew louder, and Stephen turned to see a trail of lake water leading from the bathroom to where he stood. "Found you," Chucky giggled, and Stephen spun around to see a figure at the end of the hallway. It wasn't the doll from the movies. It was Timmy, waterlogged and pale, his Superman t-shirt clinging to his small frame. Pondweed tangled in his dark hair, and his eyes had turned milky white. When he spoke, it was still Chucky's voice emerging from his blue lips. "Uncle Stephen didn't save me. Uncle Stephen watched me die." The apparition raised one dripping hand, pointing an accusatory finger. Where it pointed, the wallpaper began to peel and blacken, spreading outward like an infection. The smell of stagnant water intensified, and Stephen heard the distant sound of lapping waves despite being on the third floor of a downtown building. Stephen backed against the door, his professional training as a safety inspector finally kicking in. He'd spent years identifying structural weaknesses, finding the points where systems failed. Every supernatural manifestation had an anchor point: the mirror, the electronics, the water. The entity was using his guilt to maintain its connection, feeding off his self-blame to grow stronger. The temperature plummeted further, and ice began forming on the walls. Stephen's breath crystallized as he forced himself to think rationally. The drowning hadn't been his fault. The dock had been rotted through. A structural failure he'd missed during his inspection. The wood had given way under Timmy's weight, sending him into water that was deeper than anyone had realized due to recent flooding. "You're not Timmy," Stephen said aloud, his voice cutting through the supernatural cacophony. "And you're not Chucky either." The waterlogged figure tilted its head, and for a moment, the voice that emerged was different, older, angrier. "Clever boy. But guilt is guilt, and mine runs much deeper than yours." The apartment shuddered as if struck by an earthquake. Pictures fell from walls, their glass shattering in patterns that spelled out names: Amy, Rebecca, Joshua, Lisa. Children's names, each one carved into the supernatural consciousness that had attached itself to Stephen's trauma. Stephen understood now. This wasn't about his nephew's accidental death. It was about someone else's deliberate actions, a malevolent spirit that collected guilt and fed on the grief of the innocent. It had been drawn to Stephen's pain like a predator to wounded prey, using familiar imagery from popular culture to mask its true nature. The entity's form shifted, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath. A tall figure in a maintenance uniform, someone who'd had access to places where children played. Someone who'd used his position of trust to harm them, and who now existed in a state of supernatural rage at being stopped. "William Brennan," Stephen whispered, recognizing the name from news reports he'd researched during his own guilt spiral. A maintenance worker at summer camps and community centers, convicted of multiple murders before dying in prison. "You're using their voices to hide your own." The masquerade crumbled. The Timmy figure dissolved into shadows, replaced by a writhing mass of darkness that spoke in the voices of all its victims. The Chucky persona had been just another mask, a way to seem less threatening while it worked its way into Stephen's psyche. Stephen grabbed a fire extinguisher from the emergency box in the hallway, his safety training taking over. Carbon dioxide would displace the oxygen the manifestation seemed to need, and the cold would disrupt the temperature differential it was using to maintain physical presence. He pulled the pin and aimed at the entity's core, releasing a stream of freezing gas. The shadows recoiled, their voices rising in a harmonized scream of rage. The electronics sparked and died as their conduits were severed. Stephen kept the pressure steady, backing the entity toward the bathroom where it had first manifested through the mirror. "You chose the wrong person to haunt," Stephen said, advancing with the extinguisher. "I inspect safety systems for a living. I find the weak points." The entity's form destabilized, pulled back toward the cracked mirror that had been its entry point. Stephen grabbed a chair and hurled it at the glass, shattering the surface completely. The shadows were sucked into the fragments with a sound like rushing water, their victims' voices fading to whispers. Then silence. The apartment warmed instantly, frost melting and dripping to the floor. Stephen's phone buzzed back to life, showing 17 missed calls from his sister. She'd been trying to reach him all night, worried after finding Brennan's name in their family's old camp records. Timmy had attended that camp 2 summers before his accidental death. Stephen packed his belongings that same hour, leaving the apartment and its memories behind. He moved across the country, taking a job with a new company that specialized in playground safety, a position that let him prevent accidents rather than just investigate them after the fact. But some nights, when the wind was right and electronics hummed with static, he still heard whispers in the distance, not Chucky's voice anymore, but something older and hungrier, searching for the next person whose guilt might provide it entry into the world of the living. Stephen had survived by facing the truth of his own innocence, but somewhere out there, others were still vulnerable to the predator that wore borrowed faces and familiar voices. He kept the fire extinguisher mounted beside his bed, just in case. 3 months later, Stephen thought he'd found peace in Portland's rain-soaked streets and the methodical work of inspecting swing sets and climbing structures. His new apartment overlooked a children's playground, which felt like healing rather than haunting. Watching kids laugh and play safely on equipment he'd certified gave him purpose beyond his guilt. The first sign something had followed him came on a Tuesday morning when his smart thermostat began speaking in a sing-song voice he didn't recognize. "Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies," it chanted while displaying impossible temperature readings that spelled out coordinates. Stephen checked the location online. It was the address of his old apartment, 3,000 miles away. He called the building manager there, pretending to be a prospective tenant. The unit had been sealed off after multiple noise complaints, the man explained. Tenants reported children's voices echoing through the walls at all hours, electronics turning on by themselves, and mirrors cracking without cause. 3 families had broken their leases early. Stephen realized with the growing dread that destroying the mirror had only severed one connection point. The entity hadn't been banished. It had been contained, trapped in that apartment like a bottled genie. But supernatural forces had their own physics, and pressure builds until it finds release. His coffee maker gurgled to life at 3 a.m., brewing a pot while displaying "Miss Me" in red digital letters across its screen. The machine shouldn't have been able to show text at all. It was a simple model with only basic indicator lights. Stephen unplugged it, but the message remained glowing, drawing power from somewhere else entirely. Over the following weeks, the manifestations intensified. his laptop camera activated randomly, recording videos of empty rooms in his old apartment. The footage showed shadows moving across walls that should have been lit by morning sun. And sometimes he glimpsed familiar small figures darting between frames. Not Timmy this time, but other children, their faces obscured, but their fear palpable. The entity was adapting, learning from their previous encounter. Instead of appearing directly, it worked through digital channels, using internet connections and wireless signals to bridge the physical distance. Stephen's tablet showed him browsing histories he'd never created. Searches for Stephen Campbell Playground Inspection Portland, and images of the children who played on equipment he'd certified. It was learning about his new life, his new vulnerabilities. The breaking point came when Stephen arrived at Roosevelt Elementary for a routine inspection and found the playground empty despite the warm afternoon. Inside, the principal explained with obvious discomfort that 3 children had reported seeing the wet man watching them from behind the monkey bars. When pressed for details, they described a tall figure in a maintenance uniform who whispered their names and asked them to come closer. Stephen's blood turned to ice. Brennan's spirit had found a way to resume hunting, using Stephen as an unwitting conduit to locate new targets. Every playground he inspected became a potential hunting ground. Every safety certificate he issued a roadmap for a predator's ghost. That night, his apartment's smart home system activated every device simultaneously. The television showed static-filled footage of the Roosevelt playground at night, shadows moving between the swings. The speakers played a child's terrified whimpering, while his phone displayed photos from his work files, innocent pictures of children playing that now felt like a supernatural catalog of victims. "You can't run from what you are," came Brennan's voice from the smart speaker, no longer hiding behind Chucky's theatrical malice. "You're my eyes and hands in the world. Every place you go, every child you see, they become mine too." Stephen understood the trap now. His work as a safety inspector made him the perfect vessel, trusted with access to schools and playgrounds. His presence never questioned around children. The entity had followed him not for revenge, but for opportunity. It needed someone with his specific professional role to continue its predatory agenda from beyond death. The apartment walls began bleeding, not the theatrical gore from their first encounter, but something worse. Children's drawings in red crayon that appeared on every surface. Stick figures holding hands with a tall shadow. Pictures of playgrounds with "Help Us" written in shaky letters, and dozens of names Stephen recognized from his inspection reports. Stephen had to act before more children were endangered. He gathered every electronic device in his apartment, tablets, laptops, smart speakers, even his digital watch, and piled them in the bathtub. The entity's digital presence meant it needed technology to manifest across distances, and he would deny it those tools. He doused the pile with rubbing alcohol and struck a match. But before he could drop it, his reflection appeared in the bathroom mirror. This time, it showed the truth. Stephen wearing Brennan's maintenance uniform, his eyes empty and predatory, standing behind a group of children who cowered in supernatural terror. "You're becoming me," the reflection mouthed silently. "Fighting only makes it faster." Stephen dropped the match anyway. The electronics burst into flames with unnatural colors, blue and green fire that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The digital displays flickered rapidly, through thousands of images before going dark. Every child he'd photographed for safety documentation, every playground he'd certified, every school where he'd worked. The entity's screams filled the apartment, coming from the burning devices as its digital anchor points were destroyed. But Stephen knew this was only temporary. As long as he continued his work, as long as he had access to places where children gathered, the spirit would find new ways to use him. He submitted his resignation that morning, effective immediately, citing personal health reasons. His supervisor was understanding. Stephen had always been their most thorough inspector, almost obsessively so. No one questioned his need to step away from the work. Stephen moved again, this time to a cabin in rural Montana, where the nearest school was 50 miles away, and internet access was spotty at best. He took a job doing timber surveys, work that kept him alone in the forest, with only trees and wildlife for company. But on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the pines, he still heard whispers carried on the air. Children's voices calling his name, asking him to come back, to help them play safely. The entity was patient and persistent, and Stephen knew their game wasn't over. It was only postponed, waiting for him to lower his guard or return to civilization where young voices could once again become its prey.